Most of us spend at least some time on the internet every day, as it's become an invaluable tool in our lives. But there are many people who have dedicated an inordinate amount of time to solving certain mysteries that have left others baffled for years. And thanks to their resilience and dedication, they managed to answer questions that otherwise may have been forgotten over time. Number 5. The wilderness is a great place to just get away and forget about the everyday hustle and bustle for a little while. And in 2017, one man did just that, as he set out on a journey that would eventually take the internet by storm a year later, as internet sleuths tried to uncover his real identity. Just like many other hikers, this man decided to swap his everyday life, which involved working in the field of technology, with the freedom of being in the wild. But no one ever found out why he made that decision, even though he met many fellow hikers along the way. And they all recall him as being a kind and likable person. He was quickly given the moniker Denim by other hikers since he was strangely dressed in jeans when his journey began. Though this would change to mostly harmless shortly after when he described himself in this way while talking to fellow hikers at a campsite one night. Some people believe that this was a reference to the book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in which our planet is described as mostly harmless, though no one is certain whether this was what mostly harmless was referring to. His journey began just outside New York when he set out from a state park to the north of the city, but those he came across felt that he was ill-prepared for the wild, as he had no way of contacting anyone since he had no cell phone. Also, the provisions that he did have seemed to be too heavy, as many people would later recall that his backpack seemed too large and cumbersome to take on a long trek. They also noted that some of his gear was high-end quality, while the rest was the kind used by the occasional hikers. Some of his fellow hikers noted that he clearly hadn't abandoned his old life, as he still made notes about programming a game called Screeps in a notebook that he carried with him. When he reached the Appalachian Trail, he headed south towards Maryland, and when he eventually reached Virginia, he met a 66-year-old woman known as Obsidian by other hikers on the trail. They decided to travel together, and the two shared the next 100 miles in each other's company, during which time he was taught how to make a fire. By December of that year, he had walked to northern Georgia where he met Matt Mason, a longtime hiker, and told him that his goal was to make it to the Florida Keys, but he was unsure how to get there as he didn't have a map. Mason sold him one for $5 along with a tent, a trail guide, and a jacket. Mason would later recall Mostly Harmless paying for the items in cash, and that he had plenty more money to spare after that. The next time that Mason would get word of the mysterious hiker was through a friend who had seen him hiking south during a snowstorm in Alabama, but he said that Mostly Harmless was in good spirits and that he seemed healthy. The next person to come across his path was a woman named Kelly Fairbanks, who was, in fact, searching for someone else who was hiking through northern Florida, as she was in the habit of aiding hikers who passed through the area. When she found out that Mostly Harmless was taking on the wilderness without any means of contacting civilization, she became concerned that he may be in over his head, since temperatures were set to rise over the coming weeks, and the going could get tough, but he continued on his way towards Key West, regardless of her warnings. For the next few months, Mostly Harmless seemed to drop off the face of the earth, as no one else reported seeing him during this time. But on the 23rd of July, 2018, two men who were hiking at Noble's Camp while heading to the Big Cypress National Preserve found something that many people had feared. In a yellow tent that had been set up at the camp lay the remains of Mostly Harmless, with his hiking boots on the ground just a short distance away. They notified the authorities, who immediately went to work trying to identify him, but try as they may, it was as if the man never really existed. His fingerprints didn't match anyone in any known databases. His DNA didn't even partially match to anyone. He had no military record, and there was no missing person report for anyone matching his description. Deepening the mystery even further was the manner of his passing. Investigators stated that he had more than enough cash on him to get by, but it seemed that he hadn't spent any of it. He seemed badly malnourished, yet he had food with him that was untouched. His autopsy also didn't find anything unusual in his system, save for a small amount of pain medication. They also noted that he had no injuries and no distinguishing tattoos, though he did have an old scar on his abdomen. It seemed that he'd made no effort to find assistance, while he slowly starved, yet he was just 5 miles away from a busy highway that would have led him straight to civilization. In a desperate effort for answers, Collier County Police released an identikit of Mostly Harmless, in hopes that a family member or a friend may come forward, and Kelly Fairbanks immediately recognized him as the man who she had come across months earlier. She contacted the Collier County Sheriff's Department and forwarded 2 photos that she'd taken of him to investigators before sharing the same images on her Facebook page. This is when the floodgates opened. People started sharing details of their encounters with the man. Some had only seen him in passing, while others shared parts of their hikes with him. Everyone who had encountered the mysterious man had the same opinion of him, stating that he seemed to be a kind and quiet soul who either decided to run from his past or just wanted to be close to nature. But none of these people ever had learned the mysterious hiker's real name, and soon a Facebook page dedicated to learning his real identity was created. Reddit users did their best to find some answers, and speculation ran rife, with theories that he may have been missing since a child, or that he was on the run after committing a crime. But still, no answers were found, and in a last-ditch effort, moderators of the Facebook group that had been created decided to ask for help from a company called Othram, which specializes in solving cold cases. Othram agreed to help out after a crowdfunding campaign raised enough money for further DNA research to be done, with the use of a single bone fragment belonging to Mostly Harmless. Once a clear DNA sequence was found, it was compared to DNA in the GED match database, but this would only yield results at a later stage after some of Mostly Harmless's friends in Baton Rouge recognized him from Facebook posts, and they contacted the Collier County Sheriff's Office. One woman, who was known as Marie, recognized his handwriting and knew about the scar on his abdomen. She explained that he'd gotten the scar when he was still a young man during a period of his life when he was very unhappy. More photos of the mysterious man emerged from hikers who had met him on different trails, and it was all but certain that his real name was Vance John Rodriguez. This was confirmed shortly after, when the hiker's DNA was matched to Vance's mother, and the mystery had finally been solved, though no one fully understands just why he decided to undertake this last journey into the wild. Investigators were baffled by the fact that he hadn't sought help during his last days, though some of his friends stated that he was known to shut down during bouts of depression, and it was possible that he just gave up, deciding not to eat the food that he had with him or to find his way back home. One thing is certain, however, Vance made an impression on everyone he met during his last days, and he will not be soon forgotten. Number 4. Imagine waking up one morning to find that someone had left you a note, but since you live alone, you become convinced that that someone is entering your apartment while you sleep. This creepy scenario seems pretty unlikely, but it's exactly what happened to one Reddit user who eventually turned to the internet for advice. A Reddit user by the name of R. Bradbury 1920 stated that he had woken up one morning and noticed that a yellow post-it note had been stuck to his desk while he slept. On it was a message reminding him to run the errands that he had planned, but he had no memory of writing the note or telling anyone about them. Naturally, he grew suspicious as the handwriting of the note wasn't his, but he decided that he'd probably written it in his sleep, and so he discarded the note, deciding that there wasn't much to it. But 4 days later, the mystery deepened. He found another note on the back of his desk chair, and this time it was a reminder to save his documents on his computer. Now, he was beginning to feel uneasy and decided to check to see if there was any way that someone could have entered his apartment, but there were no signs that anyone else had broken in or been inside. This prompted him to set up a camera facing the desk in hopes that it may capture whoever was leaving the mysterious notes. 9 days later, another note appeared with the cryptic message, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you, but it's important that we do." Naturally, he tried to check footage from the camera, but there was nothing to be seen, though he did notice that his computer's recycling bin had been emptied. This led him to believe that the culprit had deleted the video files saved to his computer, though there was still no indication as to who was entering his apartment while he slept. But it only got stranger from there. When leaving the apartment one morning, he found yet another sticky note on the outside of the door, only this time it had no writing on it. He then noticed that the other doors in the building also had differently colored blank notes stuck to them. R. Bradbury, 1920, started to suspect that their landlord may have had something to do with this deepening mystery, after they compared the handwriting on the notes to their landlord's and found it to be very similar. But they were mystified as to why the landlord would be stalking them, and so they turned to the legal advice subreddit thread for help, in hopes that an attorney may be able to guide them in the right direction as far as legal recourse is concerned. They wondered whether they should contact the police, but worried that they might face legal consequences if it did turn out that they were indeed responsible for the notes, however unlikely that may seem. True to form, fellow Redditors chimed in, and the general consensus was that R. Bradbury, 1920, was indeed sleepwalking. But this mystery didn't sit quite right with Dr. Tom Scammell, who was an expert in sleep disorders. Scammell stated that it's virtually impossible for someone who's sleepwalking to write such coherent sentences, and it seemed that R. Bradbury 1920 may in fact be dealing with a stalker who had access to their apartment. A scary thought if there ever was one. Another theory was put forward by a man named Ken Roach, who works as an engineer. He speculated that R. Bradbury may be suffering from a mental disorder. It was noted that people who suffer from disorders like schizophrenia often feel like they're being watched or followed by an unknown person or organization. But Roach was determined to find a definitive answer. He started reading R. Bradbury's older post on Reddit, and he soon came to a conclusion that would crack the case wide open once and for all. In one post that R. Bradbury made on an interior design forum, they asked for advice on how to fit a desk and a bed into a very small, narrow apartment. They also mentioned that the apartment had very little ventilation, as there were no windows, and Roach suspected that hallucinations were somehow involved. Roach remembered that he and his family had once nearly perished after a carbon monoxide leak from a stove on board their live-on boat that had filled the boat's cabin, and he contacted R. Bradbury, warning him that he may be in the same situation. Shortly after this revelation, the mystery had been solved when R. Bradbury updated their post to say that they'd installed a carbon monoxide detector in their department, and when they took the first reading, it was at 100 ppm. Considering that 9 ppm is the maximum safe level for indoor carbon monoxide saturation, R. Bradbury was lucky to escape with their life, as the amount of carbon monoxide present in their apartment would have eventually led to their demise. And so, another mystery had been solved by the dogged determination of an internet sleuth who, in the end, saved someone's life despite never meeting them in person. Number 3. In November of 1997, 40-year-old William Molt worked as a mortgage broker in Lantana, Florida, and he wasn't known by his friends and family as someone who frequently consumed alcohol. But in November of that year, he decided to go out to a club where he had a few drinks. He then made a phone call to his girlfriend at around 9:30 p.m. and told her that he would be heading home soon. But it would be more than 2 hours later that he finally left the club, after which he mysteriously disappeared and he wasn't seen or heard from for over 22 years. Witnesses who saw him at the club stated that he was quiet and mostly kept to himself that night, and when he left, he didn't seem to be intoxicated. He merely got into his white 1994 Saturn SL and drove away from the club, seemingly disappearing into thin air as there were no further sightings. Investigations into his disappearance only led to dead ends, and the police asked for the public's assistance, describing William as being 6 feet tall and weighing around 225 pounds. They added that he had brown hair and brown eyes, and at the time of his mysterious disappearance, he was seen wearing a white striped Oxford shirt and gray pants, a tie, dress shoes, and a belt. He was also wearing a Gruen watch, which sported a gold band and a gold ring that contained 2 diamonds, as well as a topaz stone. But despite finding all this information, police received no further leads, and for the next 22 years, William's disappearance would baffle investigators, as there seemed to be no logical explanation and no indication as to where he may have ended up. Perhaps he decided to start a new life somewhere, or maybe he'd been the victim of foul play. These were all good theories, but there was not one shred of evidence to back them up, and conjecture was no help in solving this inexplicable case. But 22 years later, a most unexpected breakthrough in the case would finally bring a close to the mystery of William's whereabouts. A man named Barry Fay was on his way home to Wellington after he'd been in Fort Lauderdale in August of 2019 when he received a message that shocked him. A man who'd been married to Fay's neighbor in the past was looking at a neighbor's property on Google Earth when he spotted something strange. In a retention pond behind Fay's house, he noticed a dark shape submerged in the water. He immediately took a few screenshots and sent them to his ex-wife, who was still Fay's neighbor. After examining the pictures and finding the submerged shape just as strange as her ex-husband, she then forwarded the pictures to Fay, who was still on his way back to Wellington. She mentioned that the shape seemed to resemble that of a car, and Fay agreed, but didn't recognize the pond immediately since he'd only lived in the house for a little over a year. His neighbor then explained that it was the pond directly behind his house. Once he had reached home, Fay decided to take a look at the pond for himself, but he was unable to see anything under the water. He would later note that even at times when the water level was very low, he never noticed anything untoward despite spending a lot of time working on his garden near the pond. He then decided to take his investigation one step further by contacting one of his neighbors who knew he owned a drone. He asked if it would be possible to do a flyover of the pond, and the neighbor agreed. The drone's camera revealed what Fay and his neighbor had suspected. A white car was submerged in the water. They immediately contacted the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, and by 7 p.m. that evening, efforts were being made to extract the vehicle from the murky water. By the following morning, the car had been removed and the crew who was performing the extraction had left, but Fay had not been given any information on what they found. Hoping to get more information on the car, he asked around to his neighbors, but no one had any updates, save for one woman who stated that she sometimes thought that she could see a shape in the water, but she never thought much of it, and she never made any inquiries about it. He was at a loss as to how the car could have ended up in the water, as there were guardrails that would prevent such an accident. But it would later come to light that in 1997, when William went missing, they had not yet been erected yet. In fact, Fay's house had not been built yet, though the pond had been constructed by that time. Unbeknownst to Fay, the car wasn't empty. The recovery crew had discovered a person's remains inside, and the vehicle was towed to the county medical examiner's office, where it was thoroughly inspected. It was only later that Fay would learn of the remains that were found inside the car, and 2 weeks later, a positive identification was made. It was then revealed that they belonged to William Molton, who had disappeared 22 years earlier. One part of this mystery had finally been solved, but there were still questions that needed to be answered. Why had William driven past Fay's house in Wellington when his destination was Lantana, which is more than 20 miles away? All the witnesses who saw William at the club before he left stated that he was not intoxicated, but if that is the case, how did he end up driving his car into a pond? Did he fall asleep at the wheel, or was he driving too fast, losing control of his car and plunging into the water? Another perplexing question was whether William had lost consciousness from the crash and subsequently drowned, or whether he possibly suffered a heart attack or similar medical emergency that incapacitated him and prevented him from escaping from his vehicle. Unfortunately, these questions could only be answered by one man who passed away more than 2 decades before anyone learned of his eventual tragic fate. Number 2. There are few sadder events than when a child passes away unexpectedly. But this type of tragedy is made all the worse when there's no closure in their case, which was what happened in the tragic case of 4-year-old Carolee Ashby. On the 31st of October, 1968, Carolee was living in Fulton, upstate New York, and she had walked to the shops with her older sister and a cousin. While they were on their way back home, Carolee was unfortunately struck by a car. Carolee's sister and cousin weren't hurt in the incident, but Carolee was badly hurt, and she passed away shortly afterward. One might think that this was merely a tragic accident, but the driver of the car never stopped, deciding to speed away instead without so much as checking to see if Carolee was okay. And for 13 years, no one would be held accountable for this hit and run. Investigators did receive information that an 18-year-old named Douglas Parkhurst had been involved in an accident that night, and when he was approached by investigators, they examined his Buick Special and confirmed that it had been damaged in a crash. Parkhurst admitted that he had indeed been involved in an accident, but stated that he hadn't hit anyone. Instead, he insisted that he'd crashed into a cement post, but stated that the accident had occurred in Volney, which is the neighboring town of Fulton. Although investigators thought Parkhurst's version of events didn't make much sense, they had no evidence tying him to the accident, and Carolee's case went cold, with no answers provided to her mourning family. Year after year, investigators received hundreds of leads, but they never led anywhere. In 2000, the case was reopened once again, in hopes that someone may have remembered something about that night, but once again, there was no progress in Carolee's case. That is, until 2012, 44 years after the hit and run, when a retired lieutenant from Fulton named Russ Johnson was browsing Facebook. He decided to look at posts on a page about Fulton, and while doing so, added details of Carolee's case, though he likely didn't have much hope after such a long time had passed. But his idea turned out to be an excellent one, as he was contacted by a woman from Florida who had invaluable information to share, and had it not been for Johnson's Facebook post, she may have forgotten all about the incident. She told him that she'd been approached by a family member of Parkhurst's, who asked her to provide them with an alibi for the night of the hit and run, and that she was to tell anyone who asked that she'd been with him at the time. She refused, but this made little difference to the investigation as she was never asked about the incident, though she did have suspicions that it might have something to do with Carolee's case. This was the first fresh lead in decades, and investigators decided to question Parkhurst's family before approaching him. After talking to his brother and other family members, they discovered his now rusted vehicle in New Haven, behind his sister's house. They then traveled to Parkhurst's home, and he was willing to cooperate, but stated that his memory of that night was hazy. When asked whether he had been drinking that night, he said that it was possible, but he couldn't say for sure. He did, however, state that he was very sure that he wasn't the one who had hit Carolee, but later contradicted that statement by saying that he wasn't at all sure what had happened that night. When Parkhurst was informed about the statute of limitations in Carolee's case and that it had expired, and he could no longer be charged with a hit and run, his true nature revealed itself when he confessed that he had indeed been the one who hit Carolee, and that he had fled the scene of the accident since he was intoxicated. He would then provide details about that night, stating that he and his brother Lenny had been drinking at their brother Larry's house. Douglas and Lenny decided to drive to Fulton, and Douglas had to drive as Lenny was too intoxicated, and he'd fallen asleep in the back seat of Douglas's Buick. But Larry would later contradict that statement by saying that Parkhurst and Lenny were not intoxicated when they set off for Fulton. Douglas, who was driving the car, told investigators that he felt the impact when he hit something, but he thought they'd hit an animal, and so they didn't stop. He did, however, admit that when he heard of Carolee's passing, he knew that he was the one who hit her, and he decided to keep the truth from investigators when he was initially questioned. He added that if they questioned him again after that, he would have confessed, but that's mere speculation. And so, the mystery of Carolee's case was finally solved, though it didn't provide anyone with much closure since Douglas Parkhurst would not be charged and he walked away without facing the consequences of his actions. But this story was not over yet, as irony still had a part to play. In 2018, Parkhurst was at a Little League field in Sanford, Maine, and he was standing next to the field's main gate. A woman by the name of Carol Schaefer drove her car across the field for unknown reasons and struck Parkhurst, who was 68 years old at the time, and he passed away. Just as Parkhurst had done in 1968, she decided not to stop and fled the scene. Schaefer was found to suffer from mental illness, and she'd spent various periods of her life in hospitals as a result of bipolar disorder. It was found that she couldn't be held responsible for Parkhurst's demise, and she wasn't aware of her action at the time of the accident. She was instead sent to Riverview Psychiatric Hospital in Maine, where she could end up spending the rest of her life. Number 1. Most of us have cloud accounts that we use to back up important documents, photos of our families and loved ones, and anything else that we may need to secure for future use. But in 2015, one man's iCloud account was instrumental in solving a case of theft, and the two perpetrators of the crime were none the wiser. In January of that year, a man named Randy Schaefer found that his truck, which was parked and left unlocked outside his house in Houston, Texas, had been broken into, and to his dismay, he discovered that thousands of dollars in cash were missing, along with his electronic devices, which included an iPad and a laptop. The items that had been stolen, along with the money, totaled nearly $9,000, but fortunately for Randy, the two men who had committed the crime weren't the brightest, and they would soon be responsible for their own capture. Soon after committing the crime, the two men decided to celebrate by taking selfies with the iPad, and they recorded a video at a Burger King restaurant in Montrose, which can still be viewed on YouTube. In the short clip, one of the men can be seen holding up an undisclosed amount of cash before he says, "Hello America, this is Dorian from the Money Team." He then points to his accomplice, stating, "This is my brother Dylan, also from the Money Team." He then fans the cash out in front of the camera, openly admitting that they'd gained the cash from a good night's hustle. Dylan then shoves his hand in front of the camera with another wad of notes that he fans out to show off. They then continue to explain that they have no $5 or $10 notes, only 100s, and that no one should ask them what their hustle involved. Dorian ends the video by saying, "If you take care of you and yours, meaning your family, this is what you get," and Dylan chimes in with agreement. But unbeknownst to these two less than intelligent criminals, they were about to take a turn for the worst, as internet users were about to get involved in the case. The robbers were unaware that any photos that were taken by the iPad were automatically uploaded to Randy's iCloud account. When Randy realized that the two men's faces were plastered all over his account, he downloaded the photos and forwarded them to investigators. The celebratory selfies that the two men took with Randy's iPad were uploaded to Reddit by a friend of Randy's, and from there, they were spread far and wide via social media platforms that included Twitter, Facebook, as well as YouTube. This pretty much sealed the two criminals' fates. They were soon identified as 22-year-old Dylan Thompson and 22-year-old Dorian Walker Gaines by someone who went to school with the two thugs, and they referred Randy's friend to Dorian's Facebook page, which contained the incriminating video. Randy saved this video as well, in case it was deleted before police could track the two men down. But they were soon arrested, and Walker Gaines admitted that they were the ones who had burgled the car. This resulted in charges of felony theft, and Walker Gaines was held on a $10,000 bond. Thompson was held on a $5,000 bond. At their sentencing hearing, they were each ordered to serve 5 years of community supervision, and they were required to take periodic tests for illegal substances during that time. They were also forbidden from consuming alcohol, for which they were also tested. Added to these terms was an order to pay all court costs pertaining to their case, and Walker Gaines was told to repay $9,000 to Randy, as this was the total of the money and the devices that were stolen. To add to Thompson's woes, he was also found guilty of using a stolen credit card in a previous case, which was another added felony. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.